Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Skiba. This is your first recorded lecture of the year. And it is about the birth of America, specifically the creation of the Constitution. America wins its independence from Great Britain after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. America is its own nation. The Continental Congress, which had passed the Declaration of Independence, is still in power. They're still calling the shots in America. But America needs a system of government, not the tossed together Continental Congress that had run the war. And the first form of government, the first document that forms a government in America is the Articles of Confederation. They're really written in 1777 during the war, but they're not adopted until 1781. So the same year as the Battle of Yorktown, like you can see here, when George Washington defeats the British for the last time, the Articles of Confederation are adopted. The founding principle, the bedrock of the Articles of Confederation, is the idea of state sovereignty. Now, you guys have probably heard of popular sovereignty. Probably heard of popular sovereignty in your core democratic values when you learned about social studies in middle school. Whoops. But state sovereignty is the idea that states have the power to make decisions about what goes on in their own states. So the idea that Pennsylvania gets to decide what goes on in Pennsylvania and New York gets to decide what goes on in New York. There's not a overarching federal government that gets to tell them what to do. The idea, though, behind the Articles of Confederation is to create one foreign policy. Foreign policy is how a country deals with other countries, how America talks to France or how America talks to Spain. They want state sovereignty. They want states to make decisions on their own, but they also want one singular foreign policy. They don't want New York to have a treaty with France and Pennsylvania to have a treaty with France. They want to have they want to act as one nation when they deal with other countries. Of course, when I say they, I mean the early founding fathers. They want America to look like that. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had a veto on constitutional decisions. So if every state agreed with something, but one state said, nope, I don't think so, they could stop that legislation or that law. Every state was represented in the Continental Congress by 3 to 7 congressmen that were selected by state legislatures. So the Congress of each state, which they had back then, which we still have now, we have a state legislature in Lansing. 3 to 7 congressmen were sent to the Continental Congress by these state legislatures, but they could be recalled by the state legislatures at will. So if the state legislature decided they didn't like what Ben Franklin was doing, they could say, hey, Ben, come on back. You're done. The Articles of Confederation also contained a short Bill of Rights. So it listed certain rights that the people had, but it wasn't as extensive as the Bill of Rights that we're going to come to later. States had to approve of extradition. That means if you commit a crime in Ohio and then you run to Michigan, taking you back from Michigan to Ohio is called extradition. Extradition of criminals had to be approved from state to state under the Articles of Confederation. So if you committed a crime in Virginia and ran across the border to North Carolina, the Virginia police would have to ask North Carolina, hey, can we please have that person back so that we can put them on trial? Under the Constitution, which will come later, today we don't have to approve extradition from state to state. It's automatic. But under the Articles of Confederation, they did. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no power to tax. Imagine that, if the federal government could not tax. They had to ask the states for money. There was a proposal that would allow the national government to tax imports, so anything that was made outside of America and brought into America, but this proposal was never ratified. The one real achievement of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It set aside land for educational purposes, so allowing for surveying, for the setting up of colleges. And that Northwest Ordinance created the Northwest Territory, which encompasses what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, part of Minnesota. It also banned slavery in this Northwest Territory. So that's good. One good thing the Articles of Confederation did. Pause now, you're going to have a question. So there were some problems under the Articles of Confederation. After the Revolutionary War ends, there's a post-war economic depression, in part because of inflation. The states needed to pay off all the money they had borrowed to buy guns and uniforms and cannon and food for the soldiers. And in order to pay off these loans, they print paper money. Anytime you print paper money, it usually devalues your currency and it creates inflation. So after the Revolutionary War, America's economy is not really in good shape. Not only that, but a number of farmers rise up in what's called Shays' Rebellion. These are a number of farmers who are facing bankruptcy. Shay was a veteran himself, and a lot of these farmers were veterans. They had gone and fought the war, and then they came back to their farms. And because the economy is doing so poorly, they are looking at losing the farm and going to prison to pay off their debts. And so they raid a Massachusetts militia armory, and they cause all kinds of problems in rebellion of this, or in revolt, because of this bad economy. And largely in response to this armed rebellion, 5 states call for a convention in Annapolis where they're going to try and solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation. But when they get there to Annapolis, they realize, you know what, this isn't enough. These articles are so problematic. We need a broader convention where we can consider another option, not just a retooling of the articles, but a brand new constitution. And so that's what happens. There's a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Markedly not present at the Constitutional Convention are John Adams, who's serving as the U.S. ambassador to England, and Thomas Jefferson, who's serving as the U.S. ambassador to France. Now, when they go about making this new constitution, there is some sort of a controversy in Philadelphia. And that the major question is, how would representation in a national government be decided? Should they give one vote per state, just like the Articles of Confederation? Or should members of Congress be determined according to population? Obviously, smaller states, when I say smaller, I mean smaller by population, states with less people. They want a system by which each state has one vote because their population is small. More populous states, larger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania, want representation by population. This would give those states more representation because they have bigger population. The result of this controversy is what's called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. It's proposed by Roger Sherman, which creates what's called a bicameral legislature. Bi, you can think of bicycle, that means two. There's 2 chambers in a bicameral legislature, just like we ended up with in America today, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in the Senate, each state gets 2 representatives. It doesn't matter if you have 1 million people or 10 million people, you get 2 senators. And then in the House of Representatives, representation is determined by population. So in the Senate, each state had an equal voice, and in the House of Representatives, each state had representation according to population. Pause now for a question. So here's some of the major players at the Constitutional Convention. James Madison, also called the father of the Constitution. He's the author of the Virginia Plan. This guy, the plan that said, let's have representation by population. James Madison also took the most comprehensive notes and spoke more than anyone else at the Constitutional Convention. There was George Washington. He presided over the convention, but he rarely spoke. He was a quiet, calm leader who steered the convention until success. There was Alexander Hamilton, who mostly sang, but no, I'm not serious. He didn't actually sing. He advocated for a strong executive. All right, he wanted a strong national government to deal with some of the issues of the Articles of Confederation. There's a number of other major players that we don't need to really talk about. They're not going to come up on any sort of test. One important group, though, that we do need to address at the Constitutional Convention were the Anti-Federalists. Now, if we look at this word, anti, obviously against, and then federal, how many of you have heard of the federal government? That's the national government, right? So the Anti-Federalists were people that were against a strong national government. And one of them, one of the loudest Anti-Federalists was Patrick Henry. You might remember Patrick Henry from Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. He was a fiery speaker who spoke for American independence, but then spoke against the Constitution. He thought that a government, a national government, too powerful, would take away state power, and we would end up with a king, just like we had gotten rid of from Britain. Sam Adams, an important patriot from Boston, opposed the Constitution at first, but later he supported it once the Bill of Rights was added, and we'll get to that later. And then there were a number of other anti-federalists that we're not going to address. One of the biggest dilemmas that they faced at Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, after the dilemma of representation via one vote for state or representation via population, was how to avoid a dictatorship. Now, they had left Great Britain, which was ruled by a king, King George III, and many of the constitutional constitutional congressmen were afraid of a new dictatorship arising in America, because a dictatorship usually takes away your inalienable rights, as they'd mentioned in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Think about Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. They took away the inalienable rights of their people. And so at the Constitutional Convention, one of their major issues was not allowing a dictatorship in America to form. And this is how they sought to do it. The Constitution that they came up with laid out a separation of powers. There were 3 branches of government: the legislative with Congress, the executive with the president, and the judicial with the Supreme Court and other courts. Each branch of government had its own powers, and each branch of government had checks against the powers of the other branches so that they could balance each other out in power. Checks and balances, I'm sure you've heard of that. Each branch has a way of stopping another branch's power, like a presidential veto. The president can say no if Congress passes a law. Now, a balance on that power is that if 2/3 of Congress goes back and says yes, it overrides the presidential veto. Congress has the power of impeachment. If they believe that the president, a member of the president's cabinet, a member of the Supreme Court is acting in a manner that is detrimental to the United States, they can kick them out of office. And then there's judicial review, where the Supreme Court can look at a law and say, nope, that's unconstitutional. You can't make that a law, Congress. There also are enumerated powers within the Constitution. What enumerated means basically means written down. It's a list of powers that the government has and can't go beyond. So when they wrote the Constitution, they said, hey, Congress, you have these powers, no more. Don't ask for more. You can't have them. Another key way to prevent dictatorship was federalism. And the idea of federalism is that power is divided between multiple levels of government. So not only do we have different branches of government, but we have different levels of government. The federal government has certain powers, but the state government has certain powers. And then beyond that, the local government, city government, and county government has certain powers. Finally, there's something called reservation of powers, and that is prohibiting the government from having certain powers. Basically, it's a list of things the government can't do, and that comes in the form of the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment says we have the freedom of speech. The government cannot restrict our speech. That's one way of preventing dictatorship. So the beginning of the Constitution is called the preamble. And essentially the preamble lays out what the Constitution will do, but not what it actually does. It's like a mission statement. Let's see. Here's the preamble of our Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. There's what the Constitution wants to do. They want to form a perfect union, establish justice, and so on and so forth. So everything in the Constitution serves to do this. We're going to end with a final question. Don't forget you have an assignment in McGraw-Hill that you have to do to put some of what you've learned in this lecture into place. Feel free to watch again and take more copious notes if you feel like that's necessary. I'll see you next time in class. Bye.